Bom dia e boa
Good
tarde.
morning, good afternoon to everyone. I would like to start this international event, this international webinar on public policies and the scenario of the cities on a post-pandemic situation. I'll explain a little bit more about the event, but now I'm going to pass the floor to Reverend José Antônio Góes Filho, who represents the Chancellor of Mackenzie. Reverend, you have the word. Thanks for being here with us today. Thank you, Professor Carlos Leite. We are honored to be invited to participate in this event. I'm speaking on behalf of Professor Robson Grangeiro and on behalf of Mackenzie's chaplain. This devotional moment is very important for us, for our institution. We are a Christian institution and we are very happy to start. I also want to congratulate Professor Angelica, our Prorector, Professor Dr. Cleverson, and all the professors who are here with us in this great event, especially those invited from abroad. Thank you for being with us here in this event. This is a great theme, a very current event, and it's very relevant for our situation. Thinking about public policies in our cities, especially post pandemics, it's very important. Thinking about public policies, it's important always, but in a context so different, so unusual like the pandemics, this debate is even more relevant. And I also want to congratulate you on choosing this theme and on the proposal that you're bringing for our reflection. And in view of all that, I want to read the first section of the first letter of Apostle John. And I think that here we have the basis for thinking of public policies. And you will understand when I read it what we know and believe, that in the love God has for us, God is love, and those who stay in love stay in God and God in them. I believe, my friends, that thinking of public policies, whatever the context, has to do with people's well-being, social order, and the love we should use when relating to everybody. So that's why I consider this extract of the Bible as reflecting the theme of our view, because we have a reference. God is a reference. And thinking of love and the love we should use when relating to people reflects on God, the love God has for us. So when we think of doing people for the good of the others, even when we don't think objectively about that, we are expressing this aspect of love that God has for us and that we have towards the others and those we relate with. Wishing the well-being of the other, a proper social order, more beauty and harmony in our cities is something that expresses very strongly the love God has for us and the love we should have for each other. May that be the feeling that guides our thoughts and the feeling that guides each expression and each reflection we'll do on this theme today. God bless this event and each one of you who will participate and contribute to this event, and all those who will be enriched with all that will be presented today. And I want to close my speech with a prayer. God, we thank you for such a great privilege that you grant us to begin this day thinking of such a relevant and important theme. We want to ask you that you help us understand you in the light of your love for us and of the love we have for the others. And may we have in mind not only subjective aspects of this theme we're dealing with, but see it in an objective way, the way we can apply and practice these needs in our daily actions. May you bless each professor, each student, and each person who participates in this event, and may we all be enriched with everything that we are presented. We ask you for this blessing, and may everything be done in the name of God. Thank you, Professor Carlos Leite, for the invitation, and may you have a good event. Thank you, Reverend. We thank you. I'll now pass the floor to our Director, Urbanist, Professor Angelica Alvim. She's the director of the Architecture and Urbanism College of our university. Professor Carlos Leite, thank you very much for the invitation. I want to thank you all for being here. Professor Dr. Cleverser, our Rector for Extension and Culture, Reverend Góes Filho from University's Chancellor Office, Professor Jörg Schroeder, for your presence and your partnership with our program, Professor Margot, Professor Sara, and Professor Pedro. I'm very happy to be here, to be conducting this event to debate public policies and the future of the cities after the pandemics. It's a very relevant theme for today, and we need to think of the future of the cities today, not tomorrow. What does it mean to live in an urban environment, to live in a more dense areas where the pandemics has presented us with many challenges. Maybe the most pressing one is the challenge of public transportation. Yesterday I was coming to the university and I had to face intense traffic, which means that we still have very few buses on the streets. We really had an emptying of the public transportation, and this has affected the population with lower income, and we need to think of what the pandemics, how it can affect us. There's a great fear from the population of getting infected, and on the other hand, we also have the increase of home office work. This doesn't work the same way for all social classes. Of course, the lower income classes are the ones who are most affected by the pandemics, not only due to public transportation, because they have to use it to go from one place to the other. Many times you have very low quality public transportation, and in developing countries, that is common. Doesn't mean it affects Brazil, but we don't have equity in public transportation in all cities in Brazil. But we also have a very serious problems of with habitat, sanitation, public spaces, housing, comfort, and that puts into questions the issue of working from home, the mandatory social distancing we had to face, and a series of other themes that the pandemics brought us. And in many ways, I think this has come to stay. So this, I don't see only a post-pandemic scenario, but a scenario of public policies that should be a constant concern. We shouldn't be going through such a critical situation. It's a shame for a country as big as Brazil to be facing such grave issues, especially in the areas that are more vulnerable. So I think that this seminar has come in a very important moment, and I hope that from here we can create a very important publication. That's why I think the recording is very important, and the publication of this event in our channel on YouTube. And it's good to elaborate a publication with the select group of researchers you have brought together here. I also want to thank CAPES for financing part of the event, especially the PROAX. It's an excellency program for our postgraduate studies program. And also thank our colleagues and partners of the internalization program of print, especially York, who's here participating and representing this partnership. He will be receiving some of our students in the continuous double degree partnership we have. Once again, thank you all for being here. Have a good day, and I hope this event will be very rewarding for all of us. Very good. Thank you very much, Angélica, my dear colleague and urbanist. I would like to then pass the word to Dr. Cleverson Pereira de Almeida, our Pro-Rector of Extension and Culture. He's also part of the rector of University Mackenzie. Thank you for being here this morning, and you have the floor. Good morning, Professor Carlos, Professor Angélica, Reverend Góes. Good morning, our dear guests, our international guests who honor us with your participation in our event. Thank you very much for all of us who are attending this event. Our words have an institutional tone, but I didn't want it to be impersonal. It's a risk we run, but I bring you the greetings from our dean, our Dr. Carlos Vasconcelos. He has been unable to enter, and I want to invite everybody. I had the opportunity to talk to you about the great relevance we see in an event of this magnitude. It transcends in very much our university. Its character, the involvement of CAPS, the program of internalization, and the theme that we have is very important. So I was thinking of our institutional mission: educate and care for the human being for full exercising their autonomy. How can we care for the human being to exercise their citizenship if we are not concerned with a fundamental issue of social urbanism? This is a theme I am affected by, but I have no domain over. But everything that has to do with this theme you are studying with such professionalism, this mobilizes all of us, and it should mobilize the entire university, running the risk of not doing our mission, which is taking care and educating for exercising citizenship. So projects and events such as this, with such noble guests from Brazil and from abroad, people who value this theme and this university and go deep in such reflection. So moving towards the end of my speech, I need to highlight, and using words that are not mine, from Professor Angelica in a precious book that was published 4 years ago, about 4 years ago, architectura, called Architectura Mackenzie's 100 Years, and Mackenzie 70 Years, page 49, with a very precious text. I'm going to highlight a paragraph that says, the model of urbanization for Brazilian cities currently allied to the precarization of housing modes, the growth in consumption in a ever more global and unequal world, result in serious impacts on contemporary lifestyles and represent challenges for architecture, urbanism, and design. The acceleration and complexity of social transformations coming from production process and cultural process related to information society impose, and this is my emphasis, require new challenges and impose new challenges to these professionals. I believe we are now collectively contributing towards this goal, and I want to close mentioning a book by Professor Receivers called University, a Tower or a Bell. And what brings a sense to the tower is the sound of the bell. And may we reflect on that, not only today on this event, but in our current work. This is a very relevant event, not only for our university, but our work as researchers and educators in the university, especially Mackenzie. We are a communitary, confessional, and professional university. Have a very good event, and my greetings. Thank you very much, Dr. Cleverson. Great words. Let's move on with this conversation further on. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen very quickly so I can present you with the program and explain how our sessions are going to work today. Okay. First of all, I want to tell our audience that you can ask your questions through the chat. We'll have a debate session in the morning and another one in the afternoon at the end of the second session. In this morning, we'll have 4 speeches of about 15 minutes each, starting with Professor Jörg Schroeder, a dear friend and colleague. He is the director of the Institute of Urban Design and Planning of Leibniz Universität Hannover in Germany. Then next, we'll have a presentation by Professor Margot Rubin. She's a geographer. She is a PhD associate professor of the School of Architecture and Planning of the University of Witwatersrand, if I read it correctly, in Johannesburg, South Africa, with whom I had the pleasure of meeting 2 years ago with a group of researchers from Africa and India in our dear colleague and researcher, Renato Simbalista. Next, we'll have a speech by Professor Sarah Williams. She's an associate professor of technology and urban planning, director of Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism of MIT in Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you, Sarah. I don't know if you know, but about 5 years ago, I had the pleasure of watching a great presentation made by you at MIT, and then we'll close the session in the morning with a presentation by Pedro Artung. He's a lawyer, a PhD. He's a coordinator of the Human Rights and Children program for Instituto Alana in São Paulo. He's a member of the technical panel of the executive leadership of Center of the Developing Child in Harvard University. I met Pedro in a beautiful program that some institutions coordinate, and I had the pleasure to be with him in 2017 for a weekend. Harvard, and he'll bring another important light in the idea of the rights for children, and thinking of, in the post-pandemic scenario, a more friendly cities for the development of children. So you see, we have multiple views, multiple perspectives on the reality of cities. We'll have a panel that will not talk about all the aspects of a crisis. It's a very serious situation. We don't have, it's a risk to have very strong speeches or determinant speeches at this time, but this is a very important time for reflections, so we can build and plan new scenarios starting from now for such an urbanized planet. Brazil is one of the most urbanized countries in the world, with about 90% of the population living in cities. After Pedro, we'll have about 15 to 30 minutes with questions among ourselves and from the public. And then in the afternoon, we'll come back for a second session on GMT-3, that means São Paulo time, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. with a presentation by Professor Gabriel Chalita here from Mackenzie. Ana Cláudia Rosbach, she is the director of Cities Alliance for Latin America and the Caribbean. Professor Antônio Carlos Rodrigues do Amaral, he's the Dean of CEMAP, Mackenzie Center for Advanced Studies in Public Policies and Integrity Policies here in São Paulo. Also, a guest professor at Columbia, and Tadeusz Pawlowski from Columbia University. Thank you very much for being here with us. I'm ending the sharing, stopping sharing my screen, and I'll pass the floor to Professor Jörg Freuder.
Many thanks, Carlos. I'm very pleased about this invitation, and I'm looking forward to the whole conference. One moment. Very well. Starting this morning session, I would address the topic of circular cities, and I will try in the next short 15 minutes to give you some insights about this topic and what we are currently researching and thinking about it. And I would like to start with a very concrete thing now in this high debate that we will have. And the concrete thing is a prototype that some students in the master course realized last year, shortly before the pandemic. It was created in a European project, Creative Food Cycles, funded in the Creative Europe program, dealing with circularity and sustainability of food systems in cities. And this simple, very small prototype has the idea to be a folding table that can be stored in this one package. It's at the same time a garden, and it can be used to block streets, to create a new moment of community, to be information points, exchange points, sharing points, distribution points for new food systems in the city. and a remarkable item also for communities. Basically, we wanted to test this prototype in the cities, but then in the COVID situation was not possible. We hope we can do it now this autumn. And I would like to highlight, and we tested it also together with Carlos Leite, who was our guest in an event that we had in Hanover 2 years ago, a little conference. And I would like to highlight some aspects that for me make this table a bit symbolic for what we could take for after the pandemic situation. No? It's a tool to co-create commons between newest inventions of research and civic movements. It's a tool of proximity that can be a new focal point in communities. It is an effective device inside establishing circular food systems. It can contribute to cultural and behavioral change that will be necessary for more sustainable urban systems that we need. At the same time, it was digitally designed, it was digitally manufactured. So there are also newest technologies inside of this very simple table that is made of wood, what is a renewable material too. And let's say its use is linked with digital interactions that play a really vital role for the new commons towards sustainability that we need in the city. So it's a mix of really the material aspects and also the digital aspects that go for invention. And let's say prolongating towards a post-pandemic scenario, we could say that we learned a lot in the field of digitalization, to interact not only personally, but really creating new communities. We learned how to organize work and life in a new way that offers a lot of new possibilities. At the same time, we missed public space, and new engagement for public space has been created because we value it in a completely new way. We discovered new modes of mobility, especially in not food, and bike. We discovered proximity because we have been forced to proximity, but now neighborhoods and also a regional scale in many senses can play a new role because we discovered it. And we discovered also the multifunctionality of spaces, starting with the private spaces, where apartments have become working spaces, but extending also to public spaces, to working spaces. And one of the, let's say, front runner for thinking about a post-pandemic scenario in Europe has also started before of COVID-19, like our table. This is maybe more famous. It's the idea of the 15-minute city that is realized in Paris based on the politics and policies of Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, and supported by Carlos Moreno, a scientist from Sorbonne University. And this idea of the 15-minute city really puts together a lot of aspects I already mentioned, and the new value of community, the new value of proximity, connected with a deep space change of the public spaces. And effectively, the aim of Anne Hidalgo is to transform the streets in Paris to 100 cyclable streets until 2024. Now that offers not only new possibilities for movement, but really to be a new stage, a new place now to live and work for community, for culture, and also for economy in the city. This 15-minute city is based on 4 principles. One certainly is density, not only meaning, let's say, material density, but also social density, diversity, proximity, and also accessibility and availability. One of the absolutely crucial topics. Now that this is not only, let's say, something luxury, also a critique that has been offered towards Paris, one of the richest cities of Europe, but to make these models also really available for everybody in society. Well, and effectively, now it's linked to the idea of the car-free city, that, that brings also environmental advantages, to digitalization, a focus on the common good, and the vibrancy of invention, inventiveness, and culture in the city. As I pointed out already with the environmental aspects of the 15-minute city, one topic we are actually dealing with in Europe is really the influence of climate change and, let's say, the role humans play and the questions of Anthropocene. And we are in research now really talking a lot about this step from sustainability to resilience, which means not only to adapt to climate change, but to create dynamics model of change that can, let's say, work as a transition towards a new urban model. And we are dealing with finding out about pathways, about a redundancy of tools, a redundancy of concepts that will be necessary, and about the robustness that we have to involve in research, in models, but also in structural change. This, let's say, background of research, we are actually reflecting to the political background we are having. And the most important political issue is the European Green Deal. That is also an initiative started already in 2019 by the new European Commission, and that now influences all policies that are exiting from the pandemic scenario. Now, the recovery and resilience strategy of Europe is oriented towards the Green Deal. And the basic, let's say, objective is that Europe becomes the first climate neutral continent until 2050, and to reach the reduction of climate emissions to 55% until 2030. And this climate neutrality, the aim is not to combine it with a new economic model that foresees economic growth decoupled from the use of finite resources, green economy, and also the aim not to leave anybody behind. What is an absolutely crucial question in this, and it's combined with digitalization. And in the next 7 years, European Union will invest 600 billion euros in this, let's say, target line, that influences almost a third of all investments that will be done in the next 7 years in Europe. Okay, one moment here. Well, and how to reach this, let's say, eager objectives, and what is certainly needed are indicators. And what is now basically done is to define sectoral targets, for example, for transport, industry, buildings, agriculture, and see if the emission targets are reached. This is certainly a reasonable way. The problem is that only different sectors are looked at, and the difficulty is really to combine the measures in these sectors, and where does it happen in the cities. So basically the role of the cities is the biggest question in all these European Green Deal policies. And it's not at all clear how this could work. So how this Green Deal can be implemented in the cities, and also how cities and concrete living places can play a role to accelerate, to advance, to bring, let's say, dynamics into this process of change and into the urban transformation that we need. And this for sure needs to be based on a shared effort and governance, shared governance. It needs leadership and expertise, what will be also the role of the universities. It needs a shared vision and effective urban strategies that really formulate clear pathways towards this transition. And we will need new sorts of transformative instruments. And an aspect that is very much stressed in the scientific debate is really to link these objectives of decarbonization with the quality of life. Now that let's say is the background aim to make life for citizens better, and it's really crucial for the acceptance of all the measures that will be necessary in the next years. No, so really that let's say this background contributes to create livable spaces that are of use of everybody. No, and for this topic of livable spaces, there's a new initiative that is launched by the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, that is called New European Bauhaus, linking to, let's say, the historic famous Bauhaus, no, that dealt with industrialization. And her idea is now that this new Bauhaus initiative deals with the challenges of our time, that is the reduction of CO2 emissions, and the building sector causes 40% of it. And aims are renewable materials, but also affordability to reach this interdisciplinarity, basically targeting a new cultural project for Europe that is based on sustainability, inclusiveness, and aesthetics. And in the next years, there will be like lighthouse projects of this new European Bauhaus that address natural building materials, energy efficiency, demographics, future-oriented mobility, and resource-efficient digital innovation in the building sector. And this for sure now will be a major field we have to work in, and we can work in the next years. That is very interesting. I go ahead. That's, yes. And addressing circular cities, what does it mean? It's a topic we are currently working on. It's, let's say, linked and in a certain way also derived now from the idea of circular economy that is influencing a lot the policies of the Green Deal. And circular economy certainly not only regards, let's say, material cycles, the use of renewable materials, the elimination of waste, but also regards the social and economic aspects that are connected with this change. And it's also about education, it's about skills and about research. And let's say the effect, no, that this change towards circularity can have in society and in economy too. Following, let's say, definitions that are discussed, I mention this one by Ellen MacArthur Foundation, no, that are very active in this field. They define circular cities in 3 aspects. That a circular city is regenerative. So it's not only, let's say, eliminating waste and recycling, but it's actively contributing to make the environment better, to reach ecological qualities, biodiversity, that is accessible for everybody, and that it's abundant by design. What is a major topic for also for urban planning and design, no? that we have to get out of the world of the unique solutions. We will need a range of solutions and an abundance of ideas, no? in order to foster these dynamic processes we need for urban transition. Circular city now in the generic definitions regards not only buildings and energy systems, but also mobility systems, what Angelica already mentioned, bioeconomy, production systems, local value loops. And I just want to highlight some points briefly. Now, one about the paradigms of architecture, and I choose this quite famous project by Lacaton Vassal, who this year became, have been honored with the Pritzker Prize. It's a project in Dunkirk now, and they basically didn't destroy this old warehouse, but doubled it, added it, and transformed it in this new, it's a cultural place, basically, And their motto is never to destroy, always to add and transform. And I think this will be a major topic for architecture in the next years. And to discover this reuse of the existing and the recycling, not only in an ecological sense, but also in a social sense, in a cultural sense, in a sense for the communities, and in an economic sense, certainly. We call it a recycled paradigm that will influence sustainable buildings and regards not only the material resources, but also energy, regards the life cycle, the construction processes, the use processes, and basically will lead that we rethink urban materiality in a new way, you know, that changes completely the paradigm of architecture. And moving to, let's say, some functional aspects of this new urban dimension we are moving to, certainly we have to face new opportunities in work. We have to take the chances that to use the renewable resources, to invent the economic models, the entrepreneurial models, the social innovation linked to it, the digital processes, robotics, artificial intelligence, big data, teleworking. These changes that are already happening, let's say, need to be grasped for urban transformation, and urbanists have to think about, have to talk about, have to communicate, have to invent, have to co-create the places where this can happen. In a similar way, we talk about new living. That's already what I mentioned in the 15 minutes city model, about proximity, density, diversity, and accessibility, about new models of cooperative, of sharing, that regard organizational, financial aspects, how to organize living in the cities that is also accessible for many and linked with social innovation. And not at least new mobility, this complete change that they started in Paris, that let's say, not only regards making space for foot and bike movements, make it possible, but also the improvement of public transport, what is really absolutely crucial. And let's say more concrete features, like multimodal mobility nodes, where multifunctionality, streets for living, that are linked with this mobility paradigm. In the end, I want to mention two projects we are currently working on. One is the project of creative food cycles that, let's say, also regards using not only abolishing waste, but also using materials in other sectors. For example, this orange fiber used for clothes is made of the waste of the production of orange juice. And in this bioeconomy inventions, there are a lot of possibilities, let's say, to extend the topic of food into a topic of urban circularity. But starting from food, it's one of the major problems we are having in terms of sustainability. In Europe, we produce 178 kilograms per person per year in food waste, and the whole food system contributes to 25% of the CO2 emission. So it's one of the major target fields we have to address. And in this project, we see food cycles as accelerator for urban, social, and cultural transformation. Good. Now, this was a European project, international project, together with University in Genova and Barcelona. And well, you can find more information on the homepage, creativefoodcycles.org, that will show you how we address the different phases that are important in food systems to transform them into cyclical systems. You can find a collection of best practices that also include, for example, insects, that includes food nodes. This means places of distribution, places of exchange in the city that can take new forms and new roles. But that regards also regional systems and food networks that connect anew the cities with the surrounding areas, that regards cultural issues. You can look at our publications, for example, this catalog of best practices that you find on the homepage, or the book, Creative Food Cycles. Well, and a second topic I want to point to, that we are working, let's say, on the areas that are not the center of Paris or the center of Berlin, but peripheral spaces, peripheral in many senses, peripheral in urban peripheries, peripheral in metropolitan range, or in rural areas. And we are working on transition processes, the role of places and the potential of places, and the role of narratives to support this change to a transformative model, of urban sustainability. And these places now outside, let's say, outside of Paris, here you see Paris, here we have Hanover, here's Berlin, those, let's say, we have a huge range of places to deal with that have not the special conditions of metropolis. And I really believe this is one of the major working fields we will have to address too. And this regards 60% of the population of Europe. It's linked with a lot of social fragmentation and also political fragmentation we are having. And let's say we can speak of this, the dynamics of periphery in terms of resilience, in terms of habitat, but also in terms of creativity. Well, and now this can also influence, and that's the last slide I show, the way we are working in the universities, that we try to connect planning with design, and we have to get to new levels now of iterative modes doing research, of reflective modes doing research, of involving let's say, social forces already in research that will change deeply our disciplines. And for this reason, I'm talking about circular design that let's say, is not only oriented towards the aims of sustainability and resilience, but will really change the ways we work, the ways we understand, and the ways we create new knowledge. Very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jörg. Muito obrigado. Eu vou imediatamente passar a palavra para a gente.
I'll immediately give the floor, so we are not late, to Professor Margot Rubin from University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. Margot, you have approximately 15 minutes for your presentation. We have some questions from the audience. I will raise them when we are on the debate section. Thank you, Margot. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me and can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Super. Okay. I'm going to be giving unfortunately, a lot less of an optimistic perspective than the one that I think my colleague just kind of reiterated. So I'm going to be talking about something that has happened in South Africa, but I think is actually something that can be expanded and interpreted to many of the cities in the global south. So I'm going to be talking about post-pandemic governance in South African cities, but also as well be referring to what I think is happening in many contexts around the world at the moment. So just to give you a bit of background and to lead you into the discussion, in South Africa, we started seeing our first cases in March 2020. By the 27th of March of last year, we introduced a national lockdown. It was incredibly severe. It was one of the most severe in the world. People couldn't leave their houses at all unless it was to get food. You couldn't go and exercise. You couldn't walk your dog, none of that kind of thing. And within a few months, by May, we had an adjusted, a risk-adjusted system, levels 1 through 5, 5 being the most severe. one being the least severe. And so from about May, June or to September, we saw an easing through from level 3 to level 1. And then we were back into level 3 again, and so on and so forth. As many countries have seen, we went back and forth between the different levels of lockdown. And what we did see when it was very severe was that the conditions of the national lockdown was that it was national. A lot of different places saw lockdowns which were had variations according to states or according to different cities or different regions. We had none of this kind of thing. What we had was a national level lockdown. There was supposed to be variability between different places depending on hotspots, depending on where there was worst cases. This didn't happen, and so it was very severe right across the country. It was also very top-down in its governance approaches. There was a national command council, there were provincial command councils, and even local command councils. But really, all of the efforts came from national, all of the real directives came from national. And it was incredibly top-down. It was very autocratic in the way that it was done. And there were massive restrictions on mobility and on gathering. We still can't gather to a large degree. And there was, for many of us, the worst thing that happened was there was a restriction on alcohol. You couldn't buy alcohol for large periods of last year and this year. So no wine, no beer, no nothing. But there was also quite a lot of restriction on economic activity. If you could work from home, people were forced to work from home. A lot of people were just sent home. A lot of manufacturing just closed down, and a lot of activities. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, I think by Angelica, was this idea that there is a differentiation between the effects of the lockdown of the COVID on different sectors of the population. And we saw this particularly in terms of economic activity. Those in the tertiary sector were very much able to work from home, but those in the primary and secondary sectors, those in the informal economies, were simply sent home, and with very little going on. And there was very varied enforcement. In the suburbs, it was often left to self-regulation or even to kind of private security companies to ensure that lockdown happened. But in many of what we call the townships, which are the old apartheid style areas where the majority of Black and poor people live, it was very much enforced by the police. We saw quite harsh enforcement by many police in many places, and so we had a differentiation not only in terms of its impact, but also in terms of implementation across the cities themselves. The effects were a multitude. We had mass employment and livelihood shocks. We had many people who were simply sent home without any kind of income, and as of the 27th of March, their income simply ceased. We had huge numbers of people whose livelihoods were just stopped, at that particular point in time. There were some responses. There were certainly emergency responses by local government, by municipalities. There were food parcels that were handed out. There was water that was handed out. But to a large degree, what we saw was that much of this was carried out by civil society, by community-based organizations and faith-based organizations who really did assist in trying to help people who were left in these dire circumstances of really being left without any food or anything else or any money to be able to buy food. And so we saw an incredibly rapid increase in unemployment, and this happened and almost a complete shutdown of the informal economy itself. So street traders, hawkers, people who make their money one way or another from working in public spaces, all of that ceased. And as a consequence, all of the kind of chain that led to that ceased as well. Within a few months of the lockdown, of that, we started with a very modest grant to families. It was about 350 Rand, which works out to about $15 per household per month. As you can see, this isn't an enormous amount of money, but it was supposed to assist. And then what we saw was the recent ending of the grant has certainly added to anger and frustration that led to a number of street protests, which we saw spreading right across the country and in very violent kind of mass action, where something like 175 different businesses were burnt to the ground. Literally thousands of businesses were shut down by these protests, but I'll talk more to that in a minute. And in terms of the experiences of lockdown, Well, we conducted a piece of research where during the first lockdown, we asked people to keep diaries of their experiences of lockdown and to write and they're either voice notes very often, or they were written and they were sent to us and we collated this information. And so you can see that people had very different experiences of lockdown, but that it was very lonely. So I think for most people that it was a situation where there was little joy. And as somebody expressed it, as you can see from on the left-hand side, the kind of experience, people said, what we have is food, shelter, and the internet, and that's about all. But you can see that streets were deserted, people were left to stay at home, they were bored, they were tired, they were frustrated, and they were scared. And those were really the experiences that most people shared as a consequence of the lockdown itself. This is a queue that was put up for people to get their social grants and to ensure that they were able to receive their social grants from the government, welfare grants. And these trolleys were put in between everyone to ensure social distancing at the time. So just to give you some idea of the queues, and it went right round for people trying to get their money, to people trying to get their grants in order to survive. What we also had was a very interesting situation is because the state didn't step in as much as they could have, and much of the kind of social responsibility for poverty, for the starvation, for hunger was left to civil society, is that we had a situation where very odd groups of people, very unexpected groups of people stepped into the breach. So gangs, these are violent gangs, started to deliver food in Cape Town. They were the ones who basically created the kind of social infrastructure that ensured that people could eat, that people had something to go on with. They, in Cape Town, the city in south of South Africa, they ensured that there was actually a ceasefire between gangs during this period of time. Many of the gangs worked together to ensure that there was actually food provided to these very poor communities. And so we started to see something really interesting going on within the situation, and I'll talk more to it in a minute. But what we started to see was that there was a real gap between what was needed on the ground and what government could supply. We started to see a situation where there was nothing that government could do, and so we started to see these real gaps in what was going on. And then, interestingly, there were two particular areas that came under fire in South Africa during the lockdown. Two areas which the government targeted, which they really tried to put very stringent legislation and regulations on. The first was the paratransit taxi industry. Now, the paratransit taxi industry is made up of what we call minibus taxis. They are quite small. They're 15-seater small taxis. They are run by what are effectively a bunch of mafia. But they supply transport for 80% of the population. And so they're an incredibly important both economic and mobility feature of South African cities. The second area which was targeted were the informal settlements and the slums that people live in. Now, South Africa, unlike many places, does not have a huge slum population. It's about 13% of the population. So it's not huge, but it still exists. And of course, that's where the poorest and the most marginalized people do live. Okay, now what happened with this is an example on the left, you can see what the taxis look like. What happened with the state is that they tried very hard to restrict the transportation of people. So they tried to say that taxis could only be 50% full, and then the taxi industry negotiated with them, and it's a very powerful political lobby. And then the taxi industry refused, and they said absolutely not. So then the government said, oh, okay, no problem. You can do 70% of, you can be 70% full. And the taxi industry said, absolutely not, we refuse, and we will take 100%. So the government then said, okay, well, in that case, 100%. So they completely negotiated, they completely rolled over to what the taxis demanded, even though they'd been targeted. They offered 3,000 Rand per taxi to go off the road. The taxis absolutely refused. And the taxi industry pretty much did exactly what it wanted, when it wanted. But it was interesting that they were targeted as harshly as they were, in a way that many other kinds of things in South Africa were not targeted in quite the same way. Then the second area that was targeted were the informal settlements. And we've got a department which is of human settlements, water and sanitation. At the time, it was led by a minister called Minister Sisulu. is a very powerful political figure, both within the national ruling party, the African National Congress, and within the country itself. And she decided that what we needed to do was called something of de-densification of these informal settlements. And we needed to de-densify and to thin informal settlements. And she stated this a few days after the national state of disaster was declared. And they identified what were called 29 priority areas for de-densification. And the idea was to relocate people from the informal settlements, from their homes, to what they would want to call temporary or permanent dwellings, which were less dense and were basically the alternative to accommodation. So plans were basically fast-tracked to develop and for the construction of these units, either in existing projects or on new land. And the completion date was supposed to be merely weeks away within the lockdown. Province basically said that they would ask about 14,000 people to move into these units that had been completed, but the exact figures were never clear of exactly how many people they were supposed to relocate and de-densify. Now, of course, what immediately happened is that there were massive concern by civil society organizations, by slum dweller organizations. They said effectively, how is this a democratic process? How are you going to be able to get people to voluntarily leave their homes and to go elsewhere? You cannot force people to be relocated. This is not the apartheid state. This is we are now in a democratic society. We have huge constitutional law and constitutional agreements which state when and how people can move, and the fact that people cannot simply be picked up and relocated. There are also concerns about the unintended breakdown of social capital that would result from moving people from informal settlements and into these new spaces, particularly in times of crisis when people tend to rely very heavily on the social networks in order to be able to get them through. And then there were concerns about the delivery of these particular units in what are called temporary residential accommodation, TRAs. Now, South Africa has a history of creating these temporary relocation sites for people to move to. So in between an informal settlement being disbanded and people being provided with accommodation, which they're supposed to be under the Constitution, they're put into temporary accommodation. Unfortunately, much of the temporary accommodation, you can see the picture on the left-hand bottom left-hand side, is made in these corrugated kind of iron accommodation, and much of this has become permanent accommodation. People who are supposed to stay there for a year or two while something else is being built, and many people have been in these spaces for 5, 10, 15 years. And so there was concern that this is simply what would happen in the relocation of people from the informal settlements. They would be relocated into this temporary accommodation, and as a consequence of this, they would perhaps be a breakdown of the social networks, and they would be moved into accommodation which wasn't really any better than the slum accommodation that they'd moved to. And so there were also concerns that what we were seeing was basically cover. So Minister Sisulu, the minister in charge of the human settlements, she for a long time has desperately tried to get rid of informal settlements and slums. She seems to hate them. She used the word eradicate as if there's some kind of horrible disease to refer to informal settlements. She's consistently tried to say that what we need to do is get rid of informal settlements. We shouldn't upgrade them. They should just be gone off the landscape. People who live in informal settlements are no better than criminals. And so to a large degree, there's a lot of concern that the minister was simply using the lockdown and COVID as cover to camouflage her real intentions, which was to really eradicate as many informal settlements and slums as she could during this particular period. Okay. So what was really going on? What was behind it all? Well, we think that basically what we're seeing is an old equation to a large degree between prejudice and poverty and informality. And so what was happened in the kind of lockdown period, in the kind of COVID period, is that the usual equation was made. Informality is basically poverty. So informality plus poverty plus density equals disease. And this can be seen both in the informal settlements and in the taxis, which are often overcrowded, which are very difficult to manage. But what we also saw was a situation where we think that there was a ritual of performativity. So the state needed to be seen to be doing something. They weren't really doing very much, like with the taxi industry. They kept putting down this legislation, they kept putting down the statutory obligation. Oh, we will stop the taxis from being overcrowded, we will control COVID within these areas. But in reality, they had absolutely no authority, and there was nothing that they could do. Within the informal settlements, what we started to see was also this idea that they would be doing something. And another key point around what happened within the informal settlements and within the kind of governance that happened is that there was a lot of information, particularly in Gauteng, which is the state that Johannesburg sits in, that there was a lot of information around where the COVID cases were going on. And this was supposed to be fed directly into government, and the government was supposed to be able to identify where the hotspots were, and then to be able to adjust accordingly and to respond accordingly to where the hotspots were. But what they did in the end is actually not use the real information. A lot of the information, from what we understand, was actually faked and was pushed into places where there was actually it was shown that there were apparently a lot of hotspots in informal settlements. This wasn't actually true in any way, but this information was falsified to such a degree that it was made to seem as if those spaces were the spaces where there was incredible amounts of COVID infections. And so what we saw was this idea of quite a lot of using of information as cover, of misinformation as cover, as camouflage, to disguise what the real intention was, which was to control the taxi industry, or to attempt to control the taxi industry, and to attempt to control the informal settlements and to eradicate them. We think that basically what was going on was this idea that the state wanted to look like it was performing, that it was doing something, that it was actually in control of the situation, when it really wasn't. And we think that what lay really behind it was very much this kind of energy of equating informality with poverty, density, and disease, which kind of ran underneath this prejudice, which has actually existed in the South African state for a very long time and harks back to kind of colonial ideas around density, sanitation, and old things like cordon sanitaires and so on and so forth. And so all of this came to effect. But what does this actually mean for the future of South African cities? What does it mean for cities in general? Well, it really means that what we've seen is, once all of this came to light, is there's ultimately been a huge destruction of trust in the state. The relationship hasn't been good for a long time between civil society, residents, and the state, but it's become even worse over the COVID period. There's huge mistrust as people have been trying to relocate it. There's huge mistrust around the information that's been put out about what's been going on, and it's really destroyed this very tenuous link that did exist. It's also meant that sectors which previously did have some kind of relationship have had now a lot less of a relationship. So the informal sector, the taxi industry, the informal human settlements, the informal settlements, the slums, those kind of civil society organizations in the state have lost any kind of trust between them. And also what we've seen as a consequence of both this lack of trust, or both what's being seen as a state that is untrustworthy, that is frustrating, is we've seen, and that also removed the only form of welfare that did exist, which was the few hundred rand, the few dollars that were given to households in order to be able to survive, that was removed. And the consequence was mass violence, rioting, xenophobia, massive social unrest, the burning down of buildings. And then within that, the state didn't step in. It actually left things to run riot for a few days. There were a number of deaths as a consequence. And I think the consequence is that it's likely to flare up again. We've also seen a country that's effectively in recession, with unemployment being at as high as officially as 34% in some places. In places like where I live in Johannesburg, we think that it's actually much higher. It's probably sitting at about 50%, and for the youth, even higher than that. So what is the consequence of all of this? Well, the future of South African cities in terms of governance does not look good. We see mistrust between the state and civil society. We see mistrust between key sectors of the society and the state. We see situations of a disaffected, very frustrated, and very desperate population who are responding with violence and xenophobia. And we see a country which is sitting in a situation of mass unemployment. And we think that that unemployment is probably going to get worse over the next few years, not better. So I'm painting a very dark picture, I'm afraid, of the future of cities. I'm painting a very pessimistic view of what's going on. But unfortunately, the future of cities in South Africa, the future of cities in many parts of the world where we have had such incredible response to the COVID is not a good one. It's a situation of desperation, of dire consequences, and a huge amount of uncertainty going forward. Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Margot. Yeah, lots of things for us to think about and debate. Yep, challenging moment for us all in our cities. Ok, let's go. Vamos para a apresentação da Sarah Williams.
Okay, let's move on to Sarah Williams' presentation. Sarah, thank you very much for being here with us. She is from MIT. And Sarah, you have the floor.
Everyone, so great to be talking with you today, and thanks so much for the invitation to join you. My name is Sarah Williams. I am a director of the Civic Data Design Lab at MIT and also the LCAU. The LCAU is a cross-disciplinary center which combines research of architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, and systems thinking, not about the problems of yesterday, but of tomorrow. And we are motivated by radical changes in our environment and the role that design and research can play in addressing these. I myself am very interdisciplinary. I combine training in as a geographer, an architect, an urban planner, and a data scientist. And the work that I do in the lab combine those skills. I think it's incredibly important when we're thinking about issues of the city, to build multidisciplinary teams, and they're really essential to the work I do. I believe it's not just through data analytics and computation that we can understand our cities, but it's also through the work of designers and artists that can communicate that work to communities. And I discuss this process in my current book called Data Action, which argues that big data can be used for good, for tracking disease, to exposing human rights violations, and for bad, implementing surveillance and control, and that data inevitably represents the ideologies of those who control its use. I set out to provide a corrective standard of practice for working with data that's more ethical and responsible. And I hope all of you can take a look at how you can use data for a public good. So I really believe, and I imagine all of us here do today, that the future of cities must be for everyone. And this was a topic of a recent exhibition that I had at the Architecture League of New York, which was called Visualize NYC. And I really used data and data analytics to set the stage for New York City's next mayoral election, perhaps the biggest one New York City will have seen for decades. This is because of a change in term limit laws that has caused 40 leadership positions in New York City to have no incumbents running against them. So we're set to have a completely new leadership. My research lab has been working with the Center for Architecture over the last year to develop data visualizations, which we hope communicate what's at stake for the next election. And we believe that visualizations not only set the stage for understanding the community, but also helping guide leaders to the kind of change we need. And some of the points in the exhibition, and I, really look at some of the issues that we heard earlier today, even as issues, some of the key issues that are important to cities right now really is vulnerability to climate change, the rent and affordability of the city, how activity in the street has shifted, and the healthy components of our neighborhoods. And Visualize NYC allows New Yorkers to explore and expose the inequities in our city, from the lack of access to public space to affordable housing. And I believe it's a way to get into some of these bigger problems that we'll face post-pandemic. But, one of the things that people keep asking me is, will this city still be alive post-pandemic? What will its nature be? And I think, it's a funny question, because really cities have existed since the beginning of time. This image of the Middle Age map of Damascus reminds us that cities have existed since the earlier recorded history. Obviously, Damascus goes back way more than this 15th century map, but we've survived pandemics and plagues and other health crises. And I think that why cities will always remain alive is because of the efficiency and the economies of scale that density provides. And it's that vibrance of coming together to work on a shared economy that really makes cities thrive. So whether it's commerce, as you can see here in New York City, and the idea of the downtown and retail, or the new geography of jobs, and I think we've heard a lot of conversations about the fact that the knowledge economy still needs proximity. It's this kind of bumping into each other, the kind of Silicon Valley effect of density of knowledge and ideas that really generates innovation. And in fact, these kind of innovation environments also produce jobs for other kinds of industry, although some might argue that the production of these kind of mega cities, or like kind of world cities across the world, have further marginalized certain populations as people move into city centers, and it becomes less affordable for people to live there, and we continue to sprawl out. And I would say, one of the things that the pandemic might have done is changed our viewpoint of the mega city, and allowed kind of these smaller rising stars to come out on top. So, one of the things that we've seen in the United States is that there has been, during the pandemic, a move to some of our smaller cities that were already increasing their economy. This particular article talks about Greenville, South Carolina, Des Moines, Iowa, Provo, Utah, which have seen an increased population under the pandemic for this kind of smaller economies of scales that they're afforded. The idea that they might still be able to work in the New York or San Francisco, but they still want some of the benefits that density provides them overall. And here's just some charts that kind of explain this process, right? If we look at vacancy rates in some of the biggest mega cities and some of the most expensive cities in the US, we can see, rent prices dropping significantly as vacancy rates increased. But what you see in some of these smaller cities is increasing rent prices, and also a decrease in vacancy. And so what I would argue as part of what we've learned from the pandemic is the problem of the megacity might be going down, and we might be creating ability to have more equity in cities overall by allowing the economy of jobs to be spread out throughout the United States. Some would argue that the problem of downtown existed after 1950s even, and this book by Robert Fulkerson talks about the rise and fall of the downtown, the importance of the downtown as a place to come, to do shopping and do work. But really, he also argues that the downtown starts to decline even as early as the 1950s. I would say that perhaps that happened a bit later, and our downtowns have been struggling for some time to have the types of office spaces and commercial rents. And I think, you know, one thing we can see is even places like Chicago and Austin have been already trying to address the shifting downtown. So where downtown Chicago has much more commercial spaces, up and coming downtowns like downtown Austin has been creating a bigger mix between office and retail space. And I would argue that really the post-pandemic city will be looking at how to create and learn from some of these early downtown innovators in creating that mix of both residential and office space, as the downtown, I think, was already declining well before the pandemic. And here we see another chart that looks at the migration to some smaller cities. Some of the top cities that got migration during the pandemic: Santa Barbara, Louisville, Kentucky, Buffalo, Burlington, Vermont, El Paso, Little Rock. And, you know, perhaps the pandemic has taught us how to deal with some of these second and third tier shrinking cities. Another thing that I want to talk about in relation to the pandemic in the US is really some of the things that we've learned about the street and our ability to occupy the street. So negotiating the use of the street was perhaps the biggest issue for the design of cities pre-pandemic. And the innovations under the pandemic have set us up on a course of change for years to come. One of the things that I did in the Visualize New York study was really look at how we used the street during lockdown. And this is actually using cell phone data that shows the use of the street before lockdown and the use of the street post-lockdown. And we significantly have changed how we occupy and use our streets. You know, pre-pandemic and even during the pandemic, our streets have become very chaotic, including and negotiating Amazon delivery services, Uber, and micro mobility. And, you know, many places in New York act as ad hoc storage centers for Amazon, where they have kind of packages sitting on the street. And Uber cars have been waiting. There's, you know, kind of in New York City, there was new rules implemented pre-pandemic about where Ubers could go and when, and this has created some congestion on different streets as they wait up on 57th Street or 110th Street to come down into the city and pick up passengers. And that increase in traffic has also been very problematic pre-pandemic. At the same time, we had to move to opening streets that we already saw, and that encouragement to move to opening streets and closing them off to traffic, I think, has increased dramatically during the pandemic. And we don't often think about it, but in New York City, 27% of the city's total land area is made up of streets and really acts as a public space and has been an important public space under the pandemic. But as we move into kind of the post-pandemic age, how will we negotiate all of these new uses on our street? You know, whether it's a stop for a cyclist or a bicycle, or even the autonomous vehicle has become something that will dramatically change how we look at the street sidewalk or the street curb. San Francisco has already started to plan for this and, taking over parts of parking as parks and open space, and really transforming the way we think of the street as more of something that's negotiated between both the car and people, and providing essential open space. And as these new ideas have come to bear, one thing that cities have been starting to do is create zoning maps for their curbs, right? So thinking about, not just whether it's a parking lot, but, can you rent these spaces out, or can you create zoning for how they'll be used over time? And I think what's particularly interesting about that, and this was happening pre-pandemic, and now that we have all of these kind of new restaurants on the street, are we selling a new curb, and are we creating, here's another example of a map in San Francisco that really shows us the zoning of the curb and when people can access it and at what time. And, as we begin to occupy these new spaces in the city, the question for me becomes, are these spaces going to be for everyone? Are we going to start selling the curb off to people that can pay at a restaurant, or will these curb spaces be the kind of park that we see in those original San Francisco plans? And so I think as we start to occupy our streets, and you can see the occupation already coming. Here's a street near my house that's kind of occupied it for the Giglio Boys Club under the pandemic, but we have other occupations of the street, such as Black Lives Matter. As we begin to, think about the post-pandemic city, I think we really need to start thinking about whether or not these open streets will be available to everyone. And here I'm showing a map of the open streets that were developed under the pandemic. And one thing that you can notice is that many of those streets were in areas where you already have open space. Could they have been designed in a way to provide access to people who don't have access to open space already? And so I think with the companies attempting to monetize the street, we really need to think about how we're opening up these areas equitably and responsibly. And I think one thing here is that, we love all the street cafes. They are wonderful and have increased, the livability of cities. But how can we ensure these kinds of innovations are a transformation for everyone and available to all? One, I know I was asked to ask about, really talk about New York City, but I just briefly want to mention a project that I have been working on, and in relationship to the previous talk, I thought this would be very interesting. And so I'll just do it very briefly, and we can talk about it more under the question and answer. But one of the things that I've been working on during COVID is how to address the fact that many people still do not have internet, which is an essential infrastructure in our global economy, and especially relevant under COVID. And also address that in many informal communities, data to help their existence, and some of this data that was discussed in the previous conversation that could help protect the destruction of these communities doesn't exist. So under the pandemic, I created something called Living Data Hubs, which is a wireless network and data collection tool. And it's a community-owned and community-built wireless network. And over the pandemic, working with partners in Nairobi, We trained community business owners to understand what a wireless hotspot is, what is a data collection point, and we asked community business owners to submit an RFP to co-develop a wireless network on 4 sites within Cabrera. These 4 selected sites are community public spaces. And a big part of the program was training these community owners to build the network themselves. Here they're learning about how to build the network. We created materials and distributed those, as well as developed the infrastructure with a local organization called Tuna Panda. The KSP wireless network infrastructure looks like this, and each community business center has both solar panels as well as a wireless hotspot that was installed by these community business owners. And here you can see the installation happening under the pandemic. And so we've installed that and provided an essential resource and infrastructure to the communities during the pandemic, but also we've created, as I said, an infrastructure to collect data. And so each one of these hubs includes a air quality sensor, which helps them get a return on their cost for the hotspot. They actually sell the data to researchers. But also, in order to get access to the hotspot, you answer a survey question. And right now, the survey question has been about the destruction of some of the public spaces due to a roadway coming through the community. The air quality network has been linked to a global network, and you can see how much air quality data is missing in Kenya. And we are adding, hopefully, creating a new data set to really visualize the problems of air quality in Kenya. But to get back to the survey, one of the things that you do to get onto the network is you actually answer information critical to the community. So during the pandemic, they were tearing down houses in order to build a roadway. And people who came to the wireless hotspot answered questions related to how that roadway destruction was impacting their life. This data was then used to make a letter to the government to try to protect that community. So Living Data Hubs is meant to be a resource. So the work that we did in Nairobi under COVID, we hope other people can learn from that lesson. So all these training materials and guidebooks have been put online and available. And I think what's great is we not only provided an essential resource for education during COVID, but we also created something that we hope others can build from. But we also addressed some of these serious concerns that were mentioned in the previous, where the government was coming into this community under COVID and using it as an excuse to have some of the kind of earlier plans to destroy parts of the community. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk about this last COVID project. Very different parts of the world that I'm working on, but I think a really important and relevant work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado, Sarah. Vamos imediatamente passar a palavra.
Thank you, Sarah. So we will immediately give the floor to Pedro Hartung. So you have around 15 minutes. Good morning, Professor Carlos. Thank you for the invitation. Good morning, my fellow panelists and everybody in the audience. It's a great pleasure to talk with you here today. My internet is oscillating here, so if there's any problem, tell me through the chat, please, so I'll interrupt my video feed. My function here on this table that brought so many important elements for us to think about post-pandemic cities is to bring the child's view and how childs and adolescents should be put into this discussion in a prioritized manner. So I'll start with a saying by Francisco Tonucci: children are like fireflies that are bioindicators because they indicate the quality of the environment they are in. So if we don't see children circulating, this is a sign that there's something very wrong. So this is the discussion I would like to suggest here in this pandemic scenario that we still live. Unfortunately, it made impossible. So it generated a cascade of consequences for their rights and their development. And Tonucci himself says that our central role in the discussion in urban planning and the design of cities is to give back the city to the children, to give back the streets to the children, making it possible for them to move around and to count on the city not only as a living space, but as a promoter of their rights and development. As an important reflection here, but very structuring for our debate, is the understanding that children in a pre-pandemic scenario were already confined, and now it's worse. According to researchers, children that are playing in the house went from 63 to 85%. Children that played in squares reduced from 21% to 14%. 1 in 4 children presented regression in behavior during the pandemic and had their development, important parts of the development such as language and motricity, hindered. The children that were born during the pandemic are developing in a different way, with more restricted contact between people and a development repertoire that is very different due to the restriction of contact between people. And even more, the huge social pressure with lack of social protection and inequality that the pandemic generated and escalated the already existing inequalities in the society, in our social relationship, exacerbating the pressure on the families and their children. The pandemic scenario not only affected the children's relation with the city, but in a systemic way as well. And unfortunately, we discussed this very little, of the effect of the pandemic on the children, because we just presumed that the pandemic did not affect children directly, but they were affected systemically because of the change in behavior of the society. So today my talk here is about this imperative necessity for us to think of a pandemic city, because unfortunately we still live in this scenario, and post-pandemic as well, oriented from the de-walling of the children and their infancies, and with children in the middle of the topic. And a lot of this organization that works for a long time in Brazil and in the world, thinking about the well-being of the children, is to bring nature, not only human nature, as it had been discussed here, but the environmental nature as well, as a solution, accessible solution, a cheap solution with the possibility of development for these children to be de-walled, for them to return to this urban and naturalized environment with public spaces being accessible, guaranteeing the contact with the children with nature.
No centro das discussões de políticas públicas, inclusive urbanas, é uma estratégia muito inteligente, inclusive economicamente comprovada, de trazer um desenvolvimento para todos nós como sociedade. Usar a lente ou as lentes das infâncias e adolescências é pensar num desenho universal das cidades que possibilitam que benefícios sejam atingidos para todos nós, adultos, idosos e outras pessoas que convivem na mesma cidade. Mas a estratégia por meio da qual a gente atinge isso é olhando com os olhos e escutando.
And the way we look at it, we see it and look it with the eyes, through the eyes of children. And in that we can think of 4 areas of thought that are directly related to the rights of the children, or to how children experience their rights in the city. I'll focus on the 4th and last one, but I'll give a brief view of the 4. First of all, security and safety. The design of a city after the pandemics needs to look at the safety, at healthy and safe streets, minimizing risks to life. I don't know if you have the dimension, but data from the Ministry of Health in Brazil point that traffic incidents are the main cause of death for children under 14. 12 children die and 135 are sent to the hospital per day in Brazil as a result of runovers, of traffic accidents. Kids who have had 35% are caused by kids, and 28 were caused by children who were with children who are pedestrian. And another important debate, motorcycles, the lack of regulations regarding the buying and selling of motorcycles in Brazil that causes several consequences, including the accidents. In addition to thinking about the physical safety of children moving around the city, we have another threat. One of the invisible threats for children is pollution, the quality of air in our cities. In Brazil, we also we need to face this problem in the cities. We don't even monitor the quality of the air in our city. There are only 3 cities which monitor the quality of our air. São Paulo is one of them, but the level of monitoring is not adequate according to the World Health Organization mandate. Our moderate level is below the recommended level at world perspective. And we have a basic movement of vehicles in Brazil focused mostly on cars and trucks. And even the technology used in the engines in the trucks here in Brazil has not reached in Brazil yet. The Euro 6 that is used abroad is produced here, but we cannot use it here because of economical interest. And most of our pollution comes from trucks and from vehicles, trucks and cars. 50% of our vehicles are moving in the cities are trucks. So this is extremely important in terms of thinking of safety for the children. Another issue is autonomy, ensuring autonomy to the children so they can move around the city, improved mobility in the city, including moments for them to pause and stay. Cities shouldn't be only for movement and transit. If we put the focus on houses, we will abandon public spaces. We need spaces for children to stay and rest when they're going long ways to go from home to school, for example. And the possibility for leisure in the spaces is also another strategy. The 4 themes I'm mentioning are interdependent and interrelated, and they are indivisible in terms of building a city. And leisure is right for the children that has to be protected so they can express that in the cities. Also ensuring inspiration and education for children in their development. And finally, nature as a space in open spaces, natural spaces that promote children development, especially during their early years. According to data from the Brazilian Pediatry Association, in one of our programs in Atlanta, we revised a bibliography on research on children development, and it shows that the access of children to natural spaces in the city greatly contributes to their development, motor development, neural development of the visual and auditory cortex, because nature brings stimuli that promote a diversity of repertoire and of neural pathways. And here enters a very important debate regarding children development. We have several different focuses on children development, and there's a very important aspect here that brings light to that regarding neuroscience. In the early years, children have such a huge development in terms of neurodevelopment in their first years that they need healthy stimuli. And that is also done in the way you care for cities, because this is a important space to generate stimuli for the kids. And nature in the city is the environment where children receive more positive stimuli for their development. And in children development theory, this is what we call a conjunction, not only with genetics, with the nature. We bring nurture and nature together. This is a new view, a new perspective to an old debate. And looking at that regarding children in the city, considering a city with nature spaces, allowed us to develop a case with the city of Jundiaí in Brazil, a city that is really friendly towards children and places the rights of children in the center of the debate of urban agenda. They have created an exceptional cases, creating transformation in their pathways from home to school, listening to the children, institutionalizing streets for play, streets that are closed during Sundays for children to play. They have a park in the city called the Park for Children with a lot of nature, using not only elements of the environment, but using them to generate stimuli for the children. Small squares spread around the city, even in the peripheries, and developing this together and cared for by the communities, and bringing a debate on the de-walling of childhood years in schools, also adding informal and formal learning into this process. And another debate is the master plan that has to be debated. All elements that have been presented here must be analyzed by the institution so they become permanent, going even when we have changes in the government. The master plans we have that have been able to incorporate the logic of the children, like the city of Jundiaí did, they heard the children and heard how they saw the city, and this is essential for advancements in this area. We have pretty soon we'll have a debate on the master plan for the city of São Paulo, and we have to bring children into as an essential issue in this debate. And how did they do this in the city of Jundiaí? They involved all areas, several organizations, including our organization, Alana, a sensibilization of the management group to look at the area, at the issues related to children, listening to the children, participation of networks, and constant survey to monitor the data. I can also mention the case of Fortaleza, in a partnership with us in Urban 95, with the implementation of micro nature parks in the city of Fortaleza. So we can have children have direct access to these parks with nature, with the idea of German pedagogue children development researcher that allows, that focuses on the possibility of children interacting in nature, with nature, actively, looking at a park as a life and transformative element, challenging children and being inspiring for their development. And to close our conversation, we have 10 actions to improve the environment for children, bringing 10 great views to debate children and cities. First, think of the perspective of looking at the city from 95 centimeters, looking at the cities from the perspective of a child, how they experience the 360 degrees of the city. Looking at vehicles, or third, organizing traffic, building large sidewalks that are good for children, where parents can push strollers. Is a sidewalk that is good for everybody. Adding spaces for play for kids, improving pedestrian crosswalks, bringing more safety, because this is something in Brazil that kills lots of children. Reducing the speed of the cities by law, which is something that is debated in São Paulo, and bring a lot of nature with very natural spaces. And they mention also about institutionalizing these initiatives and bringing them into law so we can perpetuate them even when we have changes of government. And something that Professor Margot mentioned, we live in Latin America, in an environment of great inequality, where children are under several levels of pressure. Many of these children were already poor before the pandemics, and that's been made worse during the pandemics. A huge number of families were removed from their residences. 85,000 have been under threats. Many of them are closed in within walls, and they have little access to nature. We know how many how far and how long some of these poor families have to travel to reach our parks. Population who live in the city is also a huge problem in our cities. And that affects children, their rights, and the ability of parenting for the parents of these children. If a mother spends 3 hours in going to and from work, how does that affect the right to take care of her own children? So taking care of the children means thinking of the city for their parents and children, the pressures that incur over them, the work problem, the mobility problems, and we also have to think of cities. Cities are a space of debate and negotiation, but it's more of a predatory dispute than a negotiation. Today we have a majority of vehicles. We have a dispute of real estate interests. We have a dispute of models guided by consumption, publicity, or spaces focused on sale. As was mentioned by Professor here, the debate, the issue of Amazon and its storage spaces with the digital buying and selling, and how these pressures prevent urban interventions to be done and prevent this perspective of having things more natural. And the disputes that are happening. Schools were the last sectors to be opened in Brazil after industries and shopping areas. So there's no look at the needs of the children when we are creating policies. We need to listen to the children, showing how they feel. And in the cities, they feel like they're simply in transit. They don't even remember where they have passed through. So in their daily lives, they don't remember what they have done in the cities. And that shows how irrelevant the urban experiences for these children. So for us to bring city strongly to the center of the debate, it is essential to guarantee this relationship of the children with the city, and guarantee it's incorporated into the laws and into the debate of our master plan, ensuring the right the child has to have access to nature. I mean, access to the city, and a city that is more full of nature. This is what we mentioned, the rights of the children in a city and nature accessible by design cities, ensuring that cities are also citizens in an urban environment. Thank you very much, Pedro. This was excellent. Hi, everybody. It's noon. We are at the end of our debate time. You have gone in through the time we were reserving for questions. Many of the questions have been answered by our panelists in the chat. I was going to comment some issues. We won't have time for this debate right now, but we'll continue in the afternoon. We won't have the ceremonial for the opening, so we should have about 40 minutes at the end of the speeches for our debate. So here I'm going to just wrap up a little bit. Can you see my screen? I would like to summarize our morning with a proposal for an urban agenda, and I'm going to speak English.
Challenges and possibilities. The empowerment of local governments, new forms of urban governance, mixing bottom-up and top-down, the empowerment of the organized civil society, strengthening of local communities, the evolution of the society into small communities characterized by strong relationships between individuals and mutual support systems. The so-commented city of 15 minutes on the Global South into what I used to call complete neighborhoods, mainly in our peripheral cities, which means to face the challenges of accessing cities' opportunities, housing and basic infrastructure, services and social facilities, public spaces and green areas, including local market, and including, as Pedro was commenting, the city for the child, the early childhood-friendly neighborhoods. So here in the Global South, the 15 minutes city will be much more difficult to face, but we are working on these complete neighborhoods. Yes, the green agenda, the climate action plans, and the paradigms shift, moving to a desirable, sustainable, another model of sustainable development. Obviously, but it is contesting, unfortunately, even in Brazil, unbelievable, investing in science to improve the future and anticipating and better anticipating responses to future health crises. Evidence-based public policies, and Sarah Williams have shown us today lots of good examples. Yes, evidence-based public policy. So difficult in countries, in cities, in Brazilian countries, but so needed. Yeah, on city level. Local action plans in social urbanism and so on, integrating and territorializing the public policies. The use of new technology to assert the power of civil society in the city, humanizing, as Richard Sennett had been commented, humanizing the smart cities. The routine flexibility could be a possibility of reducing traffic and generating infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and so on, as Carlo Rotti from MIT have been publishing. The challenge of remote versus skilled physical work and the need for digital accessibility for the most vulnerable. The zip code and the health of us all. Yes, as my colleague here in Brazil, the Dr. Paulo Saldiva, has used to comment. The territories influence most of all the people's health. And we need an urgent construction of studies on Islam health in most vulnerable communities. And to close, as a new title of a new publication by Cities Alliance, upgrading precarious neighborhoods is a key for post-pandemic recovery. In closing, muito bem. 10 minutinhos aí para a gente fechar, né?
We have 10 minutes to close up. Does anybody want to say something for our guests?
Sara, Margot, York, Pedro. Not? Okay. So I would like to thank you all very much to be with us today, this morning here in Brazil. And I would like to invite you all for our second session to begin in 2 hours from now. Thank you for the support, Claudia and your team. See you there. Cláudia, pode fechar, né? Obrigado, Andresa. Obrigado a toda a equipe aí de suporte técnico.
All the team in technical support.
Obrigada, foi ótimo, professor.
Thank you, Professor. It was great.
Thank you.